Hello and welcome to this video. Today we are doing a tier list video where we are ranking arguments for atheism. I saw Ruslan making a video and I saw Alex O'Connor making a video a while back. So today we're going to try it ourselves. I have, as you can see here, a list of around 10 arguments and a bit more, ranging from the logical problem of evil, evidential problems of evil, abductive arguments, divine hiddenness, animal suffering, and so forth. And we are going to be ranking them from S to D to see which arguments are better than others. Without further ado, let's get started with the logical problem of evil. The logical problem of evil is essentially the idea that God and evil logically are inconsistent. So in other words, there is no possible world under which God and evil can coexist. So where do I rank this argument? I rank it down in the C tier. I would have put it in a D tier in its strength of arguments from a philosophical perspective, purely because of the free will defense. I think provides a plausible world for at least there to be one situation in which God and evil can coexist, and therefore philosophically it would be a D tier argument, because all that you need for a logical deductive argument to be disproven is for you to give, or at least for these arguments of necessity to be disproven, you just need one counterexample, and that one counterexample is the free will defense, which most scholars in the philosophy of religion do accept as a successful response. The reason why I put it in C instead of for D is just because it has been a very influential discussion in the problem of evil, and I guess what do they call it, creds or credibility, or the street cred that this argument has is quite high, so I'll give it a C tier. The next argument is still in the line of the problems of evil. It is the evidential problem of evil. This is just to say that there exists evil which can be, which if prevented would have either led to which would not have led to greater good or have led to greater evil. Such evil exists, therefore God most likely, due to these pieces of evidence, doesn't exist, because if God could remove it, he would remove it. In other words, there is such a thing called gratuitous evil. Now, note this isn't a logical problem in the sense that this is not arguing on terms of necessity or certainty. This is an inductive argument. And as a result, this inductive argument, I would put it on an A tier because I think that there are responses, for example, theodicies, free will theodicies, responsibility theodicies like Richard Swinburne, I think, provide a good response to this argument. Likewise, I would say soul building provides a reasonable idea for why we can expect such an argument, or at least expect why there is no gratuitous evil. And even if you are on the side to say, well, these theodicies don't work, I would say that skeptical theism, the idea that we just don't have sufficient knowledge to understand all the relationships between good and evil, at least provides some reason to think that even from the perspective of presenting the evidential problem of evil, there is some, I suppose, a lack of evidence, or at least a lack of evidence for which one can present the problem of evil. So if one wants to claim that there is gratuitous evil, we simply don't have the sufficient epistemic tools to say there is gratuitous evil. So I do think skeptical theism provides a relatively powerful response. However, I would also put it, the reason why I put it on A tier is because I think for an atheist who does not accept skeptical theism, I think there are individual problems of skeptical theism which go beyond the scope of this video. For example, reasoning about God. I think if you accept skeptical theism, then you could also make a counter argument. This is what Wielenberg and I think it is and Andrew Cullinson notes. I think it is those two, but they argue that if you accept skeptical theism, then it also implies that you cannot make any positive beliefs about God, or at least any expectations for God's actions. So that is a significant drawback for skeptical theism, and for that reason, I put the evidential problem of evil in A tier. I mean, you could put it into B tier, but I do think it is an A tier argument. Now, the next argument is the abductive problem of evil. I'm sorry if I'm skimming through this, but there is a lot of arguments to cover. The abductive problem of evil is a type of evidential problem of evil, but it also is slightly different in the sense it is a more specific argument. So this argument is presented by Paul Draper. He says, and as an abductive argument, he's arguing that the world that we observe, given theism, is less probable than the world that we observe. That means our distribution or observations of pain and pleasure, given an indifferent God, or in other words, or in another circumstance, God not existing. So his argument is essentially to say, well, we see good and evil in this world. The expectations that we have, or the probability of this world occurring, given the fact that theism exists, is you could say it's maybe 50%, right? This is random numbers. But if we think that, okay, there's some evil, there's some good in this world, the probability of this just being a random world put together by either an entity which doesn't care about us or just by random chance in general, that probability is higher. For example, if you could say, well, if we have a good God, we would expect this world to be perfect. Now, I'm not saying that this is true or I agree with it, but you could assume to say, well, okay, we probably should expect way more good than evil. Well, does our experience of the world reflect the idea that there's way more good than evil? You might say, well, no, our experience doesn't reflect that. Do I think there's a response to the abductive problem of evil? Yes, I do think there are responses. I think theodicies, if you accept a theodical argument for an evidential problem of evil, it probably works, or at least it does improve at least improve in a lesser extent, but does indeed respond to abductive problem of evil as well. And of course, narrative theodicies, I think, are particularly strong against abductive problems of evil. But nonetheless, I mean, for the brief presentation of this argument and for I suppose the specifics of this video, since I can't go into depth into everything, I would argue that the abductive problem of evil is indeed an S-tier argument, just because it is very intuitive, and as well, you know, I think there is quite, out of all the three problems of evil from the theoretical perspective, it is indeed the strongest. Now, I call this the logical problem of evil because I mistyped it. This is meant to be the pastoral problem of evil. This is the idea of, well, we experience evil. Okay, it doesn't really matter whether we have a theodicy or not, but, oh, I feel that the Holocaust is a horrible thing. It's horrible that so many people died. Therefore, I reject any possible belief to believe in God. This is the example given by Ivan Karamazov in the Brothers Karamazov, where he says, well, look, I don't care whether there's a higher order or there's higher goodness. I don't care if you provide a successful theodicy, but no matter what, I refuse to play along the lines of a God who's willing to allow all this suffering to happen. This is not a theoretical argument that Ivan Karamazov is presenting. However, what he is presenting is indeed a pastoral response. He is presenting a pastoral argument to say, well, you know, theory only goes so far. In practice, I just cannot accept that God created this world. And you know what? I think that's quite a good argument because, I mean, while I don't buy it in the sense that I pastorally think I rather have the world having God to exist in it, and in that sense, side with Dostoevsky when he says, even if Christ is outside of the truth, I would stay with the truth rather than Christ. And if you want to know more about why I like Dostoevsky, check out my previous video on why I am a Christian. I believe that from a pastoral perspective, there really isn't much that a theist can say to the atheist who just says, well, look, all your theodicies could work. I just refuse to believe in God because, well, look at this is just horrible. I just don't want to partake in the beatific vision of God. And, you know, that is a big problem as well. And that's why I put it on the S tier. And, you know, I'm tempted, and of course this is not fixed, I'm tempted to drop the abductive to an A tier and the evidential problem to the B tier. Because I do think that is probably the strongest argument against atheism. But at the same time, you know what, let's leave it like that and then let's see how it goes. Because I do think the abductive argument is definitely stronger than the evidential problem, even though I would probably put it like this. Let's leave it like this for a while and see how we go. Problem of animal suffering really depends. I mean, Alex O'Connor likes using that a lot, I know, and a lot of my friends like Amos Woolen also likes using it a lot. You know, I think it really depends on how you view the status of animals. Personally, I'll put it down in B or C, purely because I think philosophy, or at least Christian philosophy, hasn't developed to a degree in which we can say that animal lives, we do not have a rigorous way to define the value of animal lives to human lives. Now, if you are coming from maybe an atheistic perspective, or maybe you're coming from a Hindu perspective, then I think the problem of animal suffering does become a very, very big problem, because then from Hinduism, or if you're just believing in reincarnated souls, then each soul has, in theory, equal values. There's a lot of animal suffering. Therefore, under Hinduism, you could argue that it's an A or even an S tier argument, because there is a lot of animal suffering. The only problem why I say it's not a very strong argument against Christianity per se, I mean, it could be a strong argument against Christianity, but I just haven't seen enough literature or arguments in the field to say that in animal life, you can make a calculation between animal life and human life, because I'm just coming from the perspective of Christianity. If you ask me, would you rather have 10 million animals die or one person go to heaven? I would take that trade and say I'll have one person go to heaven if that means 10 million people die. Now, you could say, Josh, you're very morally callous, but that is what I think Christianity teaches us. Now, of course, from a Hindu's perspective, they'll be like, well, no, you cannot trade 10 million animals for one human life. But from a Christian perspective, and this is why I'm tempted to put animal suffering lower at C alongside the logical problem of evil, is purely because we don't have a strong calculus. of animal life compared to human life. Now, of course, if you say, well, animals, I'm not saying that, oh, let's discount all animal suffering at all. I would say 10 million humans dying, well, I mean, no, 10 million animals dying, or a human enjoying the pleasure of drinking whiskey. Well, I would say probably a human should stop drinking whiskey and have 10 million animals survive. But when it comes to things like salvation and things of soteriology, I do not believe animals have souls, and therefore I would say the problem of animal suffering is significantly lower. And that's the reason why I put animal suffering probably in C tier. Now, and for the reasons I've given already, I can see why people put it into A or S tier as well. But personally, from a Christian perspective, I'll put it into a C tier argument. Now, I'll try to keep on this problem of evil theme. The problem of divine hiddenness is, in some sense, a problem of evil of sorts, but it also isn't. The divine hiddenness is the idea that there is non-resistant non-belief. So the argument presented simply is that, if God exists, he would want people to love him and want to enter into a relationship with him. And I think Christians assume that as well. Knock and the door shall be opened unto you. Seek and ye shall find. So from this perspective, you could say, well, divine hiddenness is the idea that, well, if you accept God wants a relationship with us, then surely if people seek a relationship with God, then well, there shouldn't be people who seek a relationship with God and don't find him. Some Protestants might say, well, you people, the reason why there are these non-resistant, non-belief people is because they really aren't really that non-resistant. I mean, I think Alex O'Connor is a very good example because he describes himself as a non-resistant, non-believer. And some people might look at that and, well, you're an atheist YouTuber, mate. Clearly, you're somewhat resistant. Now, I can see why that could be an objection. I think from a theological perspective, one might be able to make the argument, and one can make the argument that there is no non-resistant non-believers, and those who do not come to Christ are truly actually resistant in some sense, consciously or subconsciously. I think that is a potential and reasonable response to make. However, I generally like viewing people with charity and saying, well, I don't know Alex personally, nor do I, and I have loads of agnostic friends who I think genuinely want to understand the truth and want to get a relationship or have a relationship with God if that relationship could occur. So they're not even non-resistant. Some people are pro-theists. I mean, you can watch my interview with Joe Schmidt on my Philosophy for All channel. I'll put a card up to that above here, which he says he is a pro-theist. He thinks that all things would be better if God exists, but he's still an agnostic. So if that's the case, then, well, shouldn't he become a Christian? Now, there are a few ways around this, but I would rank this quite highly. I would say it's probably an A tier argument, just because, I think there are good theological responses, but of course there are strong philosophical arguments as well. And the reason why I want to separate this theological arguments with this philosophical is because, as you probably note in this video so far, I've been trying to separate how arguments against God can be separated from arguments against Christianity. For example, that problem of animal suffering is a strong argument against God under certain conditions, but might not be that strong of an argument against Christianity. I think divine hiddenness is a strong argument against God. It also is a strong argument against certain formulations of Christianity, but of course, it isn't necessarily a strong argument. Well, it's not all forms of Christianity behold that, so that's why I rank it a bit higher as well. And just as a final note on divine hiddenness, I think the idea of just saying, well, all right, that person really believes that he has actually some resistant belief when even though he's claiming he's non-resistant. I think that's somewhat like the no true Scotsman fallacy of when, once saved, always saved people argue to say, well, okay, if you're saved and you leave the church, that means he was never part of the church to begin with. And you're like, well, clearly this guy's donated a significant amount of money to the church, and now the guy's leaving. Was he not a Christian to begin with? It's like, oh, he really wasn't a Christian, he really didn't believe in this sort. And I'm like thinking, yeah, it's quite difficult to maintain that, especially when people seem to really be caring about understanding the truth, really caring about understanding Christianity, understanding about God. Yeah, they still don't get there. So, I think it is a reasonable challenge to have. Now, the reason why I don't put it at S tier is because of the theological responses. I'm somewhat tempted to put it into S tier, but I'll leave it at A tier for now, and we'll see how it goes. The next argument that we have is religious diversity. And Religious diversity I'll put into B tier. The reason why I'll put religious diversity into B tier is because it depends once again on the model of Christianity that you have. If you're viewing this idea to say that, oh, the Christian God is the only way to salvation and the Christian God is the only model which works, I can see how religious diversity could be a very strong argument. However, under my model, and once again, you could turn to my interview with Dr. John Sanders, probably the leading scholar on the fate of the unevangelized, once again on my YouTube channel, Philosophy for All, we make the argument and we discuss the idea of inclusivism, which says that although Christianity is the one true religion, and in this case Catholicism expresses the fullness of the truth, it is possible for those outside of the church to be saved. And this is a tradition which goes back to Justin Martyr, who says, well, okay, some of the old people before Christ came, I think he gives the examples of Abraham, Socrates, Plato, these people, even though they didn't believe in Christ, they did believe in the Logos in some forms, such that through their engagement with the Logos, they could be saved as well. And this has been developed further on in Aquinas and with Hans Urs von Balthasar, with Vatican II and all the movements. It's a long tradition which says that, yes, Christianity is the fullness of the truth, but there is ways to salvation outside of Christianity. And why is that the case? They're still being saved through Christianity, but that's just because they've either never had the experience or chance to believe in God, or perhaps they haven't developed or reached a development or level of civilization that they can understand the fullness of the truth. And I think I would like to stress that a bit more. It's not a very binary situation of saying, well, all right, there are other religions, therefore Christianity is false, or there's only one Christianity which is maintained throughout the ages, and then there's all these other religions which also were maintained throughout these ages. If you read into the field of emergent monotheism, you'll understand that actually in early Judaic writings, Christianity was not necessarily monotheistic in a classical sense. It was monotheistic in the sense it believed that there was one omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent God in this kind of classical theist sense, but it also believed that there potentially were other angelic beings or other divine beings around them, in which God Yahweh was in conflict with. Now, what I'm saying with this example is not to say, oh, now we should all be polytheists. What I'm saying is that even within Christianity, the revelation that God has of his own nature is developing. And even within Christianity, we understand that doctrine develops. It was one given set of doctrine to the early church, but it was also a doctrine which is developed further and further as our philosophical, our theological, our human, biological, scientific knowledge developed. For example, transubstantiation would never have been a thing in the Catholic Church in the early centuries, not because they didn't believe in the real presence in the Eucharist, but they just did not have the philosophical language to describe the process of transubstantiation. Now, you could say, well, Aristotle was already written there, but of course, the early church was Platonic instead of Aristotelian, and Aristotle really came in with Aquinas through the Arabic philosophers. So if that's the case, what you see is that if we allow for doctrinal development based on the development of our human minds, then surely when it comes to religious diversity, humans also have a developing religious understanding to map onto their religious minds. In this sense, God actually gives grace. Diversity is not a problem for Christianity, but actually is an expression of Christianity's strength, because instead of saying, well, God's just allowing this confusion, he's allowing people to have different degrees of revelation based on their own cultural, philosophical worldviews and frameworks, and the complexity of those frameworks, such that, and this is something that I think Hegel and David Friedrich Strauss and all the 19th and 20th centuries philosophers note, that society moves from polytheism towards monotheism, and then potentially some people will say towards atheism, which I would not grant. It doesn't go towards atheism. People still believe in something, but it does move from polytheism to theism to accommodate the development of human consciousness and human understanding. And therefore, I put religious diversity in a B tier. In fact, I'm tempted to put it into a C tier given what I've said. I'll do a swap around with animal suffering and religious diversity. I should give more credit to animal suffering because I can see why it would be a big argument as an argument against God or atheism. But religious diversity, especially with that point of developing consciousness, I would say religious diversity actually drops to a C tier because I can see very much how religious diversity actually can fit in as an argument for God. Now that we've talked a bit about these plurality and these plural ideas, let's turn to arguments about the Bible. The arguments about the Bible is very fascinating because you hear a lot of people trying to pick on the Bible to say, well, all right, the Bible's wrong, therefore Christianity is not true. And it is something that I get very sad about when I hear people saying, well, why did I lose my faith? Oh, it's because I no longer believed that the flood narrative existed, or I no longer believe the world was 6,000 years old. I didn't believe in young earth creationists. Therefore, I then lost my faith. So this is a very big challenge, and it does occur in churches. But I think it's such a bad thing because of just how bad these arguments are. Now, of course, a lot of this depends on what you claim the Bible to be. If you're claiming, oh, the Bible is historically 100% accurate, factually accurate, scientifically accurate, then of course I can see why that paradigm would get shaken. But hopefully, as I would demonstrate in this brief period I have with you here, is that actually that's not really how some people in the early church believed it, which is Antiochene, I cannot pronounce that properly. The Christians in Antioch believed in a very literal idea, like Theophilus of Antioch, whereas the people in Alexandria, like Origen and everyone after that, took a more allegorical and analogical view of scriptures. You can see that in the early church. What I'm trying to say here is that in the early church, there was a lot of different views of scripture, which doesn't necessitate some to say, well, oh, the Bible has to be 100% philosophically, historically. Well, philosophically it has to be true, but historically and scientifically true, that is not a necessity in the early church. And as a result, this kind of framework and this milieu that we're engaging in, which says, well, we don't need 100% historical accuracy and scientific accuracy. Well, that's the milieu in which I'm responding to this in. And let's start off with the idea that the Bible is scientifically inaccurate. I'll put that in a D tier argument. In fact, if I could add one, I'll put this into an F tier argument. Can I add another one? I'm not sure. But anyhow, I'll put it into a D tier argument. The reason why I put it into a D tier argument is because the Bible isn't written as a science novel. As much as you people might want to say, oh, the Bible is scientifically accurate. When it says stars came down to fight in the valley, yeah, I'm pretty sure the writer didn't mean that Alpha Centauri, like the star or the sun, just showed up on Earth and was like, hello guys, I'm going to help the Israelites fight. That's probably not what it's saying. Scientifically, this is not a scientific treatise. Now, is this to say that no one in the early church believed to take it literally? No. As I've given the example, Theophilus of Antioch calculated through the scriptures to say the world was 5,000 years old at the time of the early church, which actually makes a 7,000 year approximation of young earth creation is quite accurate. But at the same time, as I've said, Origen of Alexandria also allowed for those discrepancies to say, well, let's take these things analogically. So this is not, when I'm giving this response, it's not me just reacting to scientific argument to say, oh, the science says this, now I need to change my theology. No, that's not what I'm arguing. I'm saying in the original church, before all your scientific theories came about, we already took it allegorically. We already took certain passages of scripture analogically. And therefore, this is not a significant challenge. And it's way easier for one to just say, well, all right, maybe I should change my understanding of the Bible. Maybe I should change my interpretation of the Bible before I then just jettison belief in God altogether. And I think that's the case as well. And that's the same with the Bible being historically inaccurate. Now, I do think the historical inaccuracy of the Bible is more important than the scientific part of the Bible. It's a stronger argument. I wouldn't put up to religious diversity because I do think that, that is still the case just because I think religious diversity and the logical problem are stronger than the historical accuracy of the Bible. But you can know that this is from scales as well. So, for example, if someone came up with a very strong argument that, oh, Jesus Christ never existed, okay, that would probably prove as a very strong argument against Christianity. Whereas if I'm just saying, well, all right, oh, the Egyptians didn't leave in a certain number, oh, there was 1 million Egyptians instead of 5,000, or there was only 5,000 Egyptians instead of 1 million Egyptians, which chased the Israelites out of Egypt. Then I'll be like, yeah, I can see where you're coming from, but it doesn't really change any key aspect of the Christian faith. And therefore, if someone says, well, the Bible is historically inaccurate, I mean, I don't think it's a good argument in general. And I think there's a lot of things people can jettison or change your interpretation of the scriptures before this actually constitutes a good argument against the existence of God. Now, is the Bible self-contradictory? Once again, Origen makes the argument that, well, Origen, this is a very fascinating aspect. Origen is a very wonderful scholar when it comes to biblical exegesis. I mean, his commentaries are wonderful. If you want to read kind of the height of Alexandrian philosophy, read Origen of Alexandria, his commentary on John. Very, very good. Now, of course, he's a somewhat of a subordinationist, but then that's for a different discussion. But nonetheless, his work is very, very good, very, very profound, and very helpful. So, in fact, Origen himself, when it comes to the scriptures, he says, well, the gospel accounts have so many differences in them that some of the writers are purposely writing different things in order to express their religious points. So he's focusing so heavily on the spiritual idea to say that, well, actually what the writers were doing here, the contradictions, the contradictions, I put this in brackets, contradictions here, were actually intentional to reveal and reflect new and Christian truth. So I think this idea of the self-contradictory nature of the Bible is once again not a very strong challenge, but I would put this in the C tier just because, of course, if it contradicts on some of the major aspects, for example, if someone brings up Gnosticism and finds some self-contradictions in terms of that, you can see where problems arise from biblical self-contradictions. But as an argument in general, I don't think it's a strong argument against Christian faith. I mean, I'm tempted to put it into D tier, but I'll put it into C tier just because of street cred in the same way of logical problem of evil. Now, the next thing, stone paradox, I would put it into a D tier just because the idea that God can create a stone so heavy he cannot lift. Ultimately, when we're defining omniscience, it goes both ways. If you say, well, God can do everything that's can only do things which are logically possible, then creating a stone that is so heavy that omnipotent cannot lift is by definition logically impossible, and therefore it defeats that argument in the sense that, well, okay, on the terms of God only being able to do logically possible things, well, there is no criteria for the stone paradox. On the alternative view, if someone says, well, okay, God can do things logically possible and logically impossible, then technically he can create a stone so strong that he cannot lift. But then even if he does create that stone, he wouldn't be able to lift it. But then if he does create the stone, he would be able to lift it. I mean, such things are logically mind-boggling, they're paradoxical. But if you assume that God can do everything logically impossible and logically possible as well, if you assume that in your hypothesis, then it follows that God can exist because you've already allowed for such logical inconsistencies to occur in your arguments, and therefore there is no stone paradox as well, because all paradoxes then just become acceptable in the same way that in philosophical logic, if you have you could prove from a contradiction all things follow. From not P and P, if you accept both of them, then all things follow. The same thing goes with the stone paradox as well. Someone could just accept God's existence if you allow for God to do everything logically possible and impossible. Now, the next arguments are about God. Now, this ties into the stone paradox it doesn't tie into the stone paradox, but it ties into the nature of God. And I've split this into two aspects: God commanding evil things and God doing evil things. Because they're different things, right? God commanding and telling people to do evil is a different criticism to saying that God does evil things. Well, God commanding people to do evil, I think, is an A tier argument. The reason why I put it into an A tier argument is because I would argue that, God allowing Job to happen, or God allowing, and if you want to hear my reflection on Job, feel free to check out my video on what I thought is the most scary book in the Bible, which is the book of Job, or telling Abraham to kill his son. People tried to get around it by saying, well, Abraham knew that his son wouldn't actually die, or he believed implicitly in the resurrection. But that just takes away from any interpretation of Abraham's actual faith. Because if someone was to tell me, hey, Josh, kill your son or kill your best friend, and I believed that the guy who told me God is going to resurrect my best friend, me killing my best friend isn't really that strong of a sacrifice, because I just know the guy's going to get resurrected anyway, so me killing him doesn't really do much. If the only reason why it makes so much sense, or is such a powerful example, is because I went in there with full knowledge that the guy was going to die, and turns out the guy didn't die, or that a miracle happened, a ram showed up and said, kill the ram instead. I'm like, all right, that's good. But it's still the case that I fully believe that what I was going to do has significant justifications. And as a result, when you say, well, God commanding evil things, I think that's a strong argument against God, in the sense of, well, you have this idea of God as this all good being, and if he's telling people to do evil stuff, then you're like, well, there's some problems there. Now, of course, it's a separate question, which then ties into my next point of, can God do evil things? Which I would argue is no. And in that sense, I'll put it into a C tier argument, just because, well, God, by definition being good, or the greatest conceivable being, cannot do evil things, because he is by definition the definition of what good is. If that's the case, then God cannot do evil things, so this is just a logical contradiction. But nonetheless, and in that sense, you could move God commanding evil things to a C tier argument. But I'll leave it up at A tier because I think if you allow, because this argument assumes that God can do evil things, whereas God doing actual evil things is a logical in contradiction. So that's a different step or a different stage of argumentation. Now, I haven't thought through exactly how that's logically different. I might be wrong with this, but it seems intuitive to me to say that God commanding evil things is, if God exists and evil exists, you're assuming that evil can exist outside of God, or that there's a judgment of God outside, or there's judgment of God which is beyond God himself. Whereas if you talk about God doing evil things, then, well, that is talking internally about his own nature, because then that's just God doing instead of God being judged by something else, because God could do evil things without us being a third person observer. For example, I don't know what example could be made, but he could create an evil world where there's no human beings to observe or no conscious beings to observe it. Now, would that still be an evil world? I don't know. But assuming that could be possible, I can see how that could be the case. So I think there's a logical difference between these two. And as well, now, is there responses to God commanding evil things? Yes, I think you could go along the lines of Kierkegaard to say, well, it's a leap of faith. We should just follow God. And the same thing kind of goes with C. It's to say, well, if God does evil things, well, we just have to have faith in him. That's his, I suppose, privilege as God to be able to do these things. But nonetheless, I think the idea of divine command theory does stand stronger with God doing evil things, because, well, that's the case. That is reality. That just is how things are. Now, of course, you could then say, well, can you have non-religious ethics? That's a different question, which I wouldn't delve into in this video, but that is something we can talk about perhaps in the comment section below if you have any thoughts about that. Now, I know I've made these two categorizations somewhat controversially, and I haven't talked in depth about what I actually think about it, partially because I haven't really thought too much about it. The reason why I put God commanding evil things is because it's just more emotive. In the same way that Pastoral is up here, I'll put it up here. Otherwise, I think philosophically, I mean, they're relatively similar, but I'll just say, pastorally speaking, it brings that up to the top. Now, of course, you could say, well, God sending people to hell is also a significant problem as well. But I would also say that God sending people to hell really depends on what you view as hell, and there's just so much theology, which I would, once again, will not get into in depth. But of course, if you want to learn more about hell, check out the interview with John Sanders. Now, finally, well, two more arguments to go. Religious ethics is incorrect. Now, for example, this could be to say, well, okay, religious ethics says abortion is wrong. Turns out abortion is right. Therefore, God does not exist. It's not really an argument against God, but once again, it is a strong challenge about it, because after all, religion, for a large part, I'm not saying all of religion is ethics, but a large part of religion is how we're meant to live our lives. It's an existential question. And therefore, if religious ethics is truly incorrect, now I'm not sure how that could be the case if you have another standard to religious ethics, say, well, your religious ethics are wrong. Not exactly sure how that standard could be established, but if it was established, this would be a very strong argument. Now, my only concern is I'm not really sure how this would be established, and therefore I'll put it into an A tier argument, because once again, with the same arguments about God commanding evil things and God doing evil things, it could. I'm very sympathetic to the view to say that if God exists, then, well, there really is not much we can say about religious ethics being wrong or God doing evil. So I'm very sympathetic to that view. But nonetheless, I think if it was the case that religious ethics is incorrect, then that would be a strong argument. And I think it is indeed. I'm tempted to put it into B tier just because, I'm tempted to just do this because I feel all of these there are responses to all of these arguments. Yeah, this is what I'll do. Because I think all these I think God commanding evil and religious ethics being incorrect is stronger than God doing evil things. But nonetheless, I mean, just my struggle with thinking how one could present, how you could think of ethics outside of God. Now, can you create ethics outside of God? Yes. But if God exists, can you create ethics? If you have the condition that God already exists, can you create an ethical standard beyond that God, assuming he exists? I'm not sure whether that's the case, or whether you could reasonably justify it, at least from a meta-ethical perspective, because I think from an atheist or a naturalistic meta-ethics, you can say, well, okay, let's try to build some models. But once you allow God to exist, that kind of already changes the whole paradigm that you're working with. So for that reason, I would say if we assume that God exists, and these arguments are all done ex hypothesi God existing, because God commanding evil things obviously presupposes that God exists in order for God to command evil things, because if you assume that God didn't exist, he wouldn't be able to exist to command those evil things to begin with. So, I mean, that would be the response here, right? So I would say, yeah, that's why I put in B and C tiers. Now, finally, there is no evidence from God. I would say that is a B tier argument, because, and this is similar to the idea of divine hiddenness, not divine hiddenness. I mean, it's a different version of the divine hiddenness argument. It's not to say, oh, is there non-resistant non-belief? is just to say, well, God is so hidden, we just do not have enough reason to believe in him. If God wanted to be loved, surely he'll make himself a bit clearer. And the reason why I put it into B tier is because I think there are good arguments for the existence of God, which are tempted to make me C tier. But at the same time, you could say, well, and likewise, if God made himself obvious, for example, wrote in the sky, God exists, as clouds in the sky, well, someone might just provide a scientific example to say, well, we don't exactly know why clouds form this way, but it just does form that way. And it was just a scientific law for at 5 p.m. on a Sunday, all of a sudden, all these clouds exist and form shape the cloud, the word God exists in the sky. So I can see how this is not a very good argument. But nonetheless, given how many people, very smart people on both sides of the debate do think that the existence of God is up for debate, this is not me saying that there is no evidence for God. I think there is evidence for God. But I do think that, should we be expecting more evidence if God existed? I don't know. I mean, partially I say yes, because a lot of smart people don't believe in God, looking at all the evidence. I mean, people like Graham Oppie and stuff like that, I don't think it's because they're irrational that they're not a theist. So I'm tempted to put it into B tier here. Now, am I happy with this list? We've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 arguments. I've been talking non-stop, and we've been going around almost 2 minutes, an argument which is going through things crazy. Am I happy with this tier list? Pastoral problem of evil as S tier, I think it's undeniable. I think that's true. Abductive problem, divine hiddenness, I think A tier. Evidential problem of evil, problem of animal suffering, I'm happy with them being on the same level, especially theologically. Theologically speaking, I'll have animal suffering lower than evidential, but for non-theological reasons, I'll keep them on the same tier. God commanding evil, religious ethics isn't correct. Yeah, that's in the right place. No evidence for God's there as well. Logical problem of evil, religious diversity, yeah. Bible self-contradicts, God does evil things, yeah, that's C tier. I'm quite happy with that. And science disproves the Bible, historically inaccurate, stone paradox, I'm quite happy with that as well. Only question is I might do that. Abductive arguments are very powerful. I think theism has to provide a stronger response to abductive problems of evil. I'm tempted to think positive skeptical theism might resolve it, but that's just my kind of too academic position speaking right now. That's probably not of much interest to you. Now, that is indeed my finalized tier list. Hope you've enjoyed this episode. Let me know your thoughts, whether you disagree or agree, or whether you put them in a different order. Let me know in the comments below. I hope this is a fair view. I'm, of course, Catholic, so I'm coming from this from theistic landscape. But this is just me having my philosophical hat on. I hope I've represented all these arguments well. If you think I've misrepresented or strawmanned any of these arguments, let me know in the comments below. But, of course, how far can I go in a 30-minute video when I'm covering 15 arguments? That's for a different debate. If you want me to make an argument or a discussion of the strongest arguments for the existence of God, then also let me know. I'll make that video for you in the comments. Stay safe. See you soon. Thank you for watching. And if you think this video would help anyone else, feel free to share it with your friends. Stay safe. See you soon. God bless. And like always, I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching and goodbye.